Joining us live in the studio today is Michael Friedlander. He's a nuclear engineer with a wide range of experience. And Michael, we appreciate your expertise on the program this morning.
My pleasure.
What do you make of what's happening right now? It just seems to go from bad to worse there.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair characterization. You know, the way Tepco is handling the situation now is that they're just going from crisis to crisis. It would not appear as though that they're actually managing the circumstance. You know, we knew at the early days of the accident that, of course, the urgency was to just get the water put someplace without it running off into the environment. But here, 2.5 years on, managing water should be their #1 priority, as we've seen.
Let's separate or talk about the environmental risks and the human risks here. So what are the risks to the environment if this is leaking into the ocean, and what are the risks to the Japanese public who thought this nuclear issue was 3 years behind them?
Yeah, so I'm going to address the people issue first. First and foremost, the risk to people outside the plant boundary is truthfully quite minimal. The nature of the radiation, the very localized nature of it, it's relatively confined to the side, which is in fact why it's a level 3 on the INES scale, because that's really what that is trying to communicate. That being said, the people who are going to have to go clean that up, that is going to be a very, very challenging thing for them to do. Because of the high levels of radiation, it's going to require robotics, it's going to require remote handling, and in fact they're going to have to do something with the debris and the material that they end up cleaning up, which is in and of itself going to make handling quite difficult. At the end of the day, if that water, if that contamination flows into the sea, it's certainly much less on the order of the original accident when the plume was coming out of the power plants and depositing over the countryside and into the ocean. So it's not on the level of the original accident, but it's a very serious event. It's a huge amount of radioactivity that's flowing into the ocean.
If this is seeping into the groundwater, going from drainage ditches into the ocean, is there any risk that it gets into the downstream water supply, for example? I mean, could this flow downstream to Tokyo and present a big risk, or is it too concentrated, as you say?
I'm not a hydrologist, and so I don't know how the aquifer in that region of the world operates. But certainly anytime you have contamination in the aquifer by diffusion process and by the normal underground flows of water, you know, who knows where it's going to end up at.
Tepco's management of all of this, how would you rate it?
This represents a textbook picture of really a failure of management. They've got plenty of resources. This is not rocket science either. We're talking about tanks of water that need to be processed and managed. You know, the fundamental standards of nuclear professionalism are you protect the reactor, you protect your people, and you protect the public. And this is just not what's going on up there right now.
Does it require international assistance, international expertise to get in there and get this job done?
Well, again, as I said, the expertise that is necessary is really how you manage massive, large-scale projects such as this. Because, again, the technology isn't really the issue. It's, you know, fundamentally managing a very, very large project.
Now, it's striking here. We're talking about these tanks, 300 tons of highly contaminated coolant water that leaked from the storage tank this week. And it struck me that one of the tanks, the original tank, didn't even have a water level gauge. So when that water started seeping out, they really didn't know that the water level had gone down. To me, this seems like the most basic of things that you would do.
I completely agree. You know, again, in the early days of the accident, when you're just firefighting and you're trying to get things under control, certainly, right? You just do what you have to do. But here, 2.5 years on, you would have expected a much higher degree of monitoring. You would have expected more equipment. You would have expected people to be on patrols, keeping a closer eye on things. You would have expected radiation monitoring. And it just appears as though none of that actually was occurring.
And given this massive cleanup effort that has to take place now, if you were managing this situation, and I know that's a big task and a big ask, what would you be doing right away? I mean, what did they need to be doing today and tomorrow?
Well, again, first and foremost, what are the priorities, right? You know, the #1 priority is stabilizing the reactors, which they are, and the spent fuel pools. The #2 priority is this massive tank farm that they have that has just millions of gallons of radioactive water. That can't be. It's subject to earthquakes, it's subject to natural disasters, it's subject to leaks, it's subject to all kinds of things. That represents a very clear and present danger to plant site and to the people that are working there. That water needs to be processed and it needs to be gotten rid of. It can't just sit there indefinitely. The second thing is they can't be in a position where they're simply collecting water at the rate of 400 tons a day and putting it somewhere. That needs to be dealt with.
I read that it takes 100 years, though, for the radioactive elements, in some cases, to break down. So how do you filter this water? I mean, is there a way to do that?
There are technologies that have been in existence for decades that will filter that water. There are some constituents, though, that cannot be filtered out. And so really the only ways, the traditional technology is you filter out what you can, and the residual that you cannot filter out, which is very low levels of radioactivity, there's really only two ways of getting rid of that. It either has to be put in the ocean, or it's going to have to be evaporated. After 3 Mile Island, that water was evaporated into the atmosphere. And I understand that it's a political hotspot, but at some point, you cannot just continue to keep collecting this water. It needs to be gotten rid of.
They took a lot of heat for dumping that water into the Susquehanna River back in 1979. We'll see what they do in this modern-day crisis. Michael Friedlander, we appreciate your expertise.